Okay, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everybody, depending on where you are. I am Awasar, Assistant Director for Academic Affairs at the African Studies Center at Michigan State University. So welcome to another Eye on Africa. Eye on Africa is the weekly speaker series that the center organizes every semester. I'm very delighted today to have Dr. Ndongo Sylla as our speaker. I'm going to go ahead and have a brief introduction, but before that, a reminder, so please use the Q&A if you have questions at the end of the talk. He'll try to answer as many as time allows. So a brief introduction. So Dr. Ndongo Samba Sylla is a Senegalese development economist. He has previously worked as a technical advisor at the Presidency of the Republic of Senegal. He is currently research and program manager at the West Africa office of the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation in Dakar. His publication cover topics such as fair trade, labor markets in developing countries, social movements, democratic theory, economic and monetary sovereignty. He authored The Fair Trade Scandal, Marketing Poverty to Benefit the Rich by Pluto Press and Ohio University Press. That book came out in 2014. He also co-authored a book with Fanny Pigeaud, which is forthcoming. So it's supposed to come out next year, February 2021, and it's titled The CFA France Story. No, it's called Africa's Last Colonial Currency, the CFA France Story. And this one also is from Pluto Press. So I think we really couldn't have a better expert to talk today about the history and what's going on with the CFA. So thank you again so much for accepting our invitation and welcome.
Thank you very much, Dr. Awasar, for your invitation. I'm really thankful to the African Studies Centers of the Michigan State University. It's an honor for me to have this opportunity to speak about the CFA Franc. So I thank all the organizers, and yeah, I will try to share my presentation with you as I prepared a PowerPoint. Could you please enable the share screen option, please?
Okay, 1 second. I'm gonna.
That's great. Yeah, I will talk today about monetary colonialism in 21st century in Africa, and I focus on the CFA franc because it is the last colonial currency still circulating in Africa, in Central Africa and West Africa. When we talk about the CFA franc, in fact, we have to say that it's an acronym for two currencies. The currency itself was born in 1945 during colonial times, just after World War II. So originally, the acronym CFA franc meant the franc of the French colonies in Africa. The currency circulated in the sub-Saharan Africa part of the French colonial empire. And 75 years later, after its birth, the CFA franc remains a colonial currency, a French-controlled currency system operating in 14 African countries. And I try to show that during my presentation. But to make things clear for everybody at the outset, the CFA franc, as I said, was born in 1945. At that time, it was a single currency circulating in the sub-Saharan part of the French colonial empire. But following the independencies in the 1960s, the CFA franc has been renamed to refer to two separate currencies. In this image, you will see that we have countries of the CFA franc zone from West Africa, 8 countries, Senegal, Guinea-Bissau, Mali, Burkina Faso, Ivory Coast, Togo, Benin, and Niger. And in Central Africa, we have 6 countries, Equatorial Guinea, Cameroon, Gabon, Central African Republic, Congo, Brazzaville, and Chad. And for West Africa, the CFA franc refers to the franc of the African financial community, and it is issued by the BCAO. The BCAO is the Western African Central Bank. And so the BCAO is issuing this currency for the 8 country members of this monetary zone. In Central Africa, the CFA franc refers to the franc of the financial and 14 countries constitute the Comorian franc is separate from the CFA franc, and it is issued by the Central Bank of the Comoros, but it is subject to the same rules as the CFA franc, but it has a different parity rate for its peg to the euro, because all these 3 currencies are pegged to the euro. And we could say that from its birth to nowadays, the CFA franc rested on 3. So the fixed peg means that the external value of the CFA franc is always fixed. The French currency.
You're kind of cutting it. It's not clear. Can you repeat again? We didn't follow the first part. It was very blurry.
Okay, I was saying that the CFA franc, since its birth, rested on 3 main pillars and 2 counterparts. The first pillar is the fixed peg to the French currency, so the French franc, and since 1999, the euro. The fixed peg means that the external value of the CFA franc is always fixed vis-a-vis the French currency, so the French franc at that time, and since 1999, the euro. The second pillar is the free transferability. This means that there is a free movement of capitals and incomes between the CFA franc countries and between the CFA franc countries and France. So their profits, their dividends, etc., could move freely in this zone and between this zone and France. And that means that French investors, European investors can invest and disinvest freely. The third pillar is the convertibility guarantee by the French Treasury. It looks like a complicated expression, but it just means that the French Treasury is ready to lend money, euros, to CFA franc zones. Whenever those central banks are devoid of any foreign exchange, any euro, any dollar, the French Treasury will step in to lend them the desired amounts of euros. And as we'll see, actually, the French Treasury has seldom performed that role of guarantor of the CFA franc. There are 2 counterparts to this convertibility guarantee by the French Treasury. The first is what is called the centralization of the foreign exchange reserves. That means that all the foreign exchange reserves, at least part of them, are centralized at Paris, at the account of the French Treasury, let's say managed by the Bank of France. So, for example, every time the CFA franc countries receive US dollars, euros, or yens, or yuans, half of it will be deposited at the French Treasury. This is a counterpart to the so-called convertibility guarantee. The second counterpart to this convertibility guarantee is that the French government is represented in the organs of both central banks with implicit veto power. Often they say they have no veto power, but at that time, this was inscribed into the legal statutes of the central banks. But now it has been hidden, but nonetheless, the French government decides the monetary policy and exchange rate policy of the CFA Franc zone, articulated on 4 points. Part one, briefly, I will make a story of the French monetary imperialism, which started let's say 1 century before the birth of the CFA franc. The second part will be about the continuities and change since the independences and now. Part 3 will be an economic assessment of the CFA franc. Who wins, who loses with the CFA franc, and what are its shortcomings. And part 4 will be about the current alternatives to the CFA franc. So the first point is that after the abolition of slavery in France in 1848, French slave owners were given financial compensation for their financial losses because they lost their slaves, and their slaves were considered at that time as movable assets, what is called in French bien meuble, so as goods. So one part of the reparations was used to set up colonial banks controlled by former slave owners in some French colonies, like in Guadeloupe, in Guyana, in Martinique, but also in Senegal. And so in 1853, the Bank of Senegal was created. It was based in Saint-Louis, and it was set up as a colonial bank, so dominated by slave owners. And its activities started only 2 years later, in 1855. This bank was dominated by trading companies from Bordeaux, France, and was mainly used to defend the interests of the trading companies against the competition from local entrepreneurs. And it financed mainly import and export activities. There's a huge literature on that. Their role has been to maintain African countries in some form of international division of labor, the export of commodities and the import of manufactured products from the metropolis. The Bank of Senegal was ended in 1901 and replaced with the Bank of West Africa, the BAO. And the BAO followed the same logic of protection of metropolitan interests. And you could see in this image, a banknote issued by the BAO, the Bank of West Africa, in 1937. This banknote portrayed a white woman representing Marianne. Marianne is the symbol of French identity and the unity of the French Empire. Marianne, in this picture, took in her hands an African mother and her son. The ideological and distorted message from this banknote is straightforward. The empire is taking care of its African colonial subjects. But yeah, that's the story. In 1939, there was another interesting development. It was the creation of the Franc zone. At the outset, I have to say that between 1817 and the mid-1930s, the international monetary system was mostly based on the gold standard, the international gold standard. And national currencies were pegged to the gold and convertible into gold. This monetary system receded after World War I, but was briefly resuscitated soon after. England ended the pound convertibility in 1931. In this context of breakdown of the international monetary system, there was strong anti-imperialist rivalries and growing protectionism. The dominant powers at that time recentered their economic and financial relationships around their respective colonial was created in this context. France abandoned also the gold standard in 1936, and the Franc zone was created in September 1939, just before the World War II, as a trade and monetary bloc shield for France. The members of the zone shared the same foreign exchange legislation, and also there was a protectionist vis-a-vis the non-members of this trade zone. And so the Franc zone gathered territories under French domination in Asia, the Pacific, the Americas, and Africa. 1945 is another important date because it coincides with the creation of the CFA Franc. because France was ruined after World War II. There were many shortages, high increase in price levels, lack of foreign exchange, and so the French currency had to be devalued. Its external value has to be lowered vis-a-vis the US dollar and the British pound. Until then, what prevailed was what was called monetary unity, and it was somehow a symbol of French pride: one empire, one currency. The French currency circulated under different exotic forms in the whole empire, except from some parts of it. But with the devastation of the war, there was one technical question that arose. Should the French currency be devalued evenly throughout the empire, or should the rate of devaluation of the French franc be variable according to the context? And this latter option was chosen by the French provisional government and gave birth to the CFA franc, officially created on December 26, 1945, at the same time as the Pacific franc. The Pacific franc still continues to exist in the four Pacific territories under French domination. In 1945, when the CFA franc was created, the CFA franc had a shocking parity vis-a-vis the French currency. One CFA franc equal to 1.7 French franc. This was not what the type of relationships we could observe in the British Empire. In the British Empire, the African colonies had exchange rates whose value was lower than the external value of the British pound. But the French decided to give an overvalue exchange rate to their colonies. And in 1948, one CFA franc equal to 2 French francs. That means when you had one CFA franc, you could have 2 French francs. So the French franc was twice stronger. The CFA franc was twice stronger than the French franc. And so the CFA franc was born overvalued, meaning that its external value was higher than justified by the economic fundamentals of the country using it. And this situation would remain until now. Why France imposed such a monetary unity? One of the reasons is that France wanted to reconquer the trade shares it lost during the war. Because during the war, the African colonies diversified their trades, and even some of them started to industrialize. And France wanted to reconquer these trade shares, and to that end, an overvalued currency handicapped the exports from African colonies to the other parts of the world. And at the same time, it acted like a subsidy to the imports from the French metropolis, because the French economy was so weak that it could not compete with the other powers. So it needed to have and the CFA franc had that role in some respect. 1960, since the independences, mostly all former African colonies decided to issue their own currency as a symbol of their newly acquired national sovereignty. Hence, colonial monetary blocks in the continent were progressively dismantled. For example, the sterling area, the Belgian monetary zone, the Escudo zone, and the Pesida zone were all dismantled, except for the franc zone. Why? Because the French government anticipated that decolonization would be inevitable, but it decided to concede independence without a real handover of its sovereign powers on sovereign domains. And France conditioned the accession to independence of its former colonies in sub-Saharan Africa to the signature of so-called cooperation agreements in domains like foreign trade, foreign affairs, external trade, currency management, defense, strategic raw material, etc. The deal was basically from France: I grant you your territory its national independence, but I remain sovereign over all the domains above. And in this slide, you could see some examples of cooperation agreements. For example, the cooperation agreement signed by Gabon authorities the day of its official proclamation of independence said, quote, "The Republic of Gabon commits to facilitating the storage of strategic materials and products to the benefits of the French armed forces. Should it become necessary for security reasons, it also pledges to limit or prohibit exports to other countries." This was signed by Gabon and by all other countries which were former colonies of France. Below, there's another type of cooperation agreements regarding the monetary management of their foreign exchange reserves. Quote, the states of Equatorial Africa confirm their membership of the monetary union, of which they are members within the Franc zone. All the revenue and expenditure operations of the states of Equatorial Africa will be made via the transfer of purchase of foreign currency on the Paris foreign exchange market. So that's the principle of the centralization of foreign exchange reserves in Paris at the French Treasury. And this was signed by Congo, Chad, and Central African Republic, and all other countries of the CFA Franc. And there is a very telling quote about this situation we call in our book, Independence Without Its Attributes. The French Prime Minister at that time, Michel Debré, sent a letter to its Gabonese counterpart in July 1960. And he said in that letter, quote, we grant independence on the condition that the state, having gained its independence, endeavors to respect the cooperation agreements. The one does not go without the other. That means we will give you the independence, but it will be a hollow independence with no sovereign attributes. As most African leaders were trained in France, and some of them even having seated at the French parliament as MPs, they accepted to sign these agreements. All of them, except for Sékou Touré, because Sékou Touré was a trade unionist leader, and he demanded the independence of his country, Guinea, which he obtained through a referendum in 1958. Guinea was the sole country to say, the sole territory to say that we want independence. The other countries said we want to stay with France within the community. And Guinea had its independence 2 years before the other African countries under French domination. And this is a picture of Sékou Touré, born in 1922 and he died in 1985. And he was a president of Guinea between 1958 and 1984. And when Guinea decided to challenge France on the CFA Franc and on other matters, there was a strong reprisal from France. And this imperialist repression has been implemented through an operation called Persil. And Persil operation was and they trained and Sékou, but they did not achieve it themselves using their own printing press, created Guinean banknotes, and they flooded that into the Guinean economy to disrupt it. And meant that led this operation. You could see him in this image. He's Maurice Robert, and he was the chief of the secret services in Africa, French secret services in Africa. And he said at that time, the operation was a total success. Guinea's economy, already very weak, never fully recovered. So Guinea has to pay for its desire of independence. And it was also a warning to other countries saying that if you want independence, you will have to pay it like Guinea had. And there was other instances of imperialist repression with Togo and Mali. On the left-hand side of this slide, we have the picture of Sylvanus Olympio. He was a former Togolese prime minister. He was trained at the London School of Economics. On December 12, 1962, he created by law a national central bank because he wanted to escape from the CFA Franc. But on January 13, 1963, he was killed by Togolese soldiers trained in France. And since he was killed, Togo's national currency never saw the light of the day. On the right-hand side, we have the picture of Modibo Keita. He was a former Malian president. He was a socialist. He decided to leave the CFA Franc in 1962. Mali started to issue its own national currency, but this monetary experiment failed. Why? Because Mali is a landlocked country, and its neighbors under French influence, Senegal, Cote d'Ivoire, retaliated by severing their trade ties with Mali. And at the same time, the monetary management of Mali was not orthodox because money was created without being invested to improve productive capacities. So Mali returned to the franc zone in 1967. And Modibo Keïta would be removed from power, and he died in very strange circumstances. Of the franc zone. This was a special context marked by the demise of the international monetary system, the gold exchange standard, and there was also a growing dissatisfaction of African head of states with the CFA Franc currency arrangement. And in that context, France accepted some concessions. The first was that the headquarters of the BEAC and the BCAO were moved respectively to Yaoundé in Cameroon and Dakar in Senegal. Their staff, previously 100% French, was Africanized. The second concession was that the mandatory deposit rate of foreign exchange reserves, the French Treasury, was lowered from 100% to 65%. Third concession, the number of the French representatives in the organs of the BEAC and the BCAO was lowered, but their veto power was still maintained. And at last, Mauritania and Madagascar left the franc zone. Their depart would be compensated later on by the arrivals of Equatorial Guinea in 1985 in the CEMAC zone and of Guinea-Bissau in 1997 in the West African Monetary Union. In the 1980s, there was another trend, the Europeanization of the CFA franc. And this started in 1994 with the devaluation of the CFA franc, the first devaluation of the CFA franc vis-à-vis the French franc since in 1948. The CFA franc was devalued by 50%. The African head of states were, most of them, opposed to the devaluation of the CFA franc because they knew its economic consequences in terms of increase in prices, increase in the debt level, etc. And France and the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, they decided to devalue the CFA franc despite this opposition. At that time, it was a blackmail. Either we devalue or you are cut off from any international aid. So this
seems like we lost him, Dr. Sylla. Okay, sorry for that interruption. Hopefully he will join soon again. See, the connection is not that great in Dakar.
Had a slight internet issue, connection issue. So I was saying that in 1999, the euro replaced the French franc and became the new anchor to the two CFA franc. That means now the CFA francs were pegged to the euro. Their value was fixed in terms of euro. And since then, the CFA franc is under the double tutelage of France and of the political and monetary authorities of the Eurozone, because France negotiated the peg to the euro with the European monetary authorities, because most European countries, at least some European countries, was not convinced by this arrangement, and they were afraid of the consequences for the French budget, because the French took the pledge to guarantee the CFA franc, and it was a budgetary pledge. And so some countries like Germany wanted to have some guarantees, and yeah, they were not favorable to that arrangement. And so they tell France, yeah, we accept this pact, but every major decision, we have to be advised. So if there is a new member in the CFA franc zone, the European monetary and political authorities have to be informed, and if the CFA franc had to be devalued, the Eurozone political monetary authorities has also to be informed, and their consent should be obtained. So now the CFA franc is no longer under French domination. It's under French domination and under European domination. And that's explained that the framework, the monetary framework, the macroeconomic framework has tended to replicate the Eurozone framework. And the BCAO and the BEAC, since then, they changed their status, and they became formally independent vis-a-vis their member states, the African member state, but they are still not independent vis-a-vis the French government. And the monetary framework has also been very stringent and oriented towards, let's say, budget consolidation. That means less fiscal activism from the African governments. So in some way, with the arrival of the euro, the CFA franc countries have become an appendix of the Eurozone. This has been the main development, let's say, if I sum up quickly, during the last 60 years. And now part 3, an economic assessment of the CFA franc. So an economic assessment about the CFA franc. Because if African economists who are critical of the CFA franc give their assessment, they say they are biased, they are against France, or things like that. So I think the most sensible way to approach this issue is to quote the French themselves, because the French government commissioned a report in the 90s and to assess what the CFA franc and what the franc zone brings economically to France. And I will quote this report, because what the report said is more or less relevant currently. And the first advantage of the franc zone is that France can pay its imports from franc zone countries in its own currency. This is really important, because this allowed France to save on foreign currency and keep up its own exchange rate. This was especially valid at the time France has its own currency, the French franc, because the French franc was a very weak currency and it was regularly devalued. So having the possibility to buy its imports in its foreign currency participated in allowing France to save its foreign currency, and at the same time not to weaken its own exchange rate, which was already weak. And the second advantage is that the French companies operating in the zone benefits from stable outlets, and stable and non-negligible, especially in a time of a crisis. The third advantage is that the French economy benefits from a trade surplus with regard to the franc zone countries, because France exports a lot, but does not import enough from African countries. So France has a trade surplus, structural trade surplus, which also provided a far from negligible amount of exchange reserves, which have also sometimes been used to pay France debts. And this has been said by the report, not by myself. Another advantage is that the French companies have the guaranteed freedom to repatriate their revenue and capitals without any foreign exchange risk, because there is this fixed peg, and because there is this free transfer policy, and because France decides the zone exchange and monetary policy. Another important advantage is that France enjoys a system of politics that doesn't cost it anything, since its supposed convertibility guarantee has rarely been put into effect, because if African countries have foreign exchange reserves at the French Treasury, that means means that, yeah, they do not need the French guarantee. And the rules of the CFA Franc are made such that the BCAO and the BEAC will seldom be in a situation where they will objectively need the guarantee from the French Treasury. So if we see between 1960 and now, this so-called guarantee has been activated only in the 1980s, and it has been activated only to help French companies, let's say, transfer their incomes and capitals, because they all expected a devaluation of the CFA franc. Except for that, there had not been any activation of this guarantee. So this peg is guaranteed by African countries and the resources at their disposal. So with this system, this is a system of free lunch, political control, economic benefit with practically zero cost. All the costs are borne by African populations. And there is a very telling court ruling, which says that it was in 2012, because there was a case which has been brought to the French Conseil d'Etat, which is the highest French administrative court. And in his ruling, the French court was saying the management and control of the BEAC is the Central Bank of West Africa, is notably ensured by French representation within this body. The activity of the BEAC, which governs monetary cooperation between France and 5 Central African states, is of particular interest to the French economy. This has been a court ruling. The CFA franc is a French currency in some way under French domination and is benefiting French interests. And so there are some number of arguments that have been raised to justify, let's say, the so-called benefits of the CFA franc. If you see why countries accept to be in a monetary union, it's expected from a monetary union, you could not find that in the CFA franc zones. If you see first, the answer is no. Trade within the African zone, franc zone, is just 10% of their external trade of its members. In Central Africa, in the CEMAC zone, the regional trade is only 5% of their external trade. So they are sharing a currency since 1945, 75 years, and they only achieve a regional integration of just 5% of their trade. Say that because you have a low inflation, low rate of inflation, and you have this fixed peg, you have the French guarantee, this will prove attractive for investors. Ghana, which has its own national currency not pegged to any currency, Ghana has a stock of foreign direct investment higher than all the 8 countries using the CFA franc combined. When we say stock of foreign direct investment, that means when we make the sum of all the net, let's say, flows of foreign direct investment, Ghana had a higher stock compared to the 8 countries of the CFA franc in West Africa combined. Same case in Central Africa, the Democratic Republic of Congo, which has its own national currency, but it's a country which is dollarized, meaning that their national currency is used in tandem with the US dollar and other currencies, had a higher stock of foreign direct investment than 5 out of the 6 countries belonging to the CEMAC. So clearly they could not say that being a member of the CFA franc zone is an element of financial attractiveness. That's not the case. It's not borne by facts. Lower inflation and exchange rate stability. Yes, that have been the achievements of the CFA franc zone. But these so-called achievements, they have their counterparts because they have been made possible by a deflationary framework. When we say deflationary, that means low credit creations and an environment where the cost of labor, and the prices are really low generally. And this has a huge impact as we'll see. And in terms of long-term development, we'll see below that, there has been no long-term development in the CFA franc countries. So what is wrong with the CFA franc? there are two types of arguments. There is a political argument saying that this currency system is still under domination of the French government, who controls and decides on monetary and exchange rate policy, manufactures coins and notes. These political symbolic aspects are really important. And these are the kind of aspects that social movements, Pan-Africanist movement are leveling against France. But there is another type of argument used by economists like myself. Uh, what is wrong first is that the fixed peg is harmful to the two CFA Franc countries' unions because it prevents the use of the exchange rate as a shock absorber. Because when you have a flexible currency, when you have a shock, an economic shock, you could use your exchange rate to absorb the shock instead of letting your economy adjust, let's say, through quantities, let's say through more unemployment and through less spending by the government. And in somehow, and countries to severe austerity policies during bad economic cycles. They are good thing. In particular, the exports are denominated in US dollars. And so that means whenever the euro appreciates vis-a-vis the US dollar, whenever the value of the euro is higher than the value of the US dollar, that means that African economies are losing competitiveness. And this kind of peg tends to place African countries in a situation where they rely heavily on imports, and especially imports from the Eurozone. So in some way, this peg to the euro contributes to maintain the African economies in their specialization as producers of primary products. And another, let's say, shortcoming of this currency system is that there is low credit creation by the banking system. There is limited financing available for the productive economy. All the financing is short-term. For example, you take the case of my country, Senegal, 77% of all the bank loans have a duration of less than 1 year. 44% of the oldest than 1 month. And those bank loans do not finance the most productive economy, like for example, the agricultural sector. No, just short-term economic activities, trade activities. And an important shortcoming is the high levels of profit remittances and illicit financial flows. I'll give some numbers below. Table is long-term economic decline and stagnation sometimes in the franc zone. This table in some way describes the economic performance of the CFA franc countries using the evolution of their real GDP. GDP is a gross domestic product per capita. So gross domestic product per capita more or less is the average national income measured at constant prices in this table. You will see that the second column is the level of real GDP per capita of all the countries of the franc zone in 2018. The third column shows the best level of GDP, real GDP per capita achieved during the last the fourth column shows the year when this best level of real GDP per capita was obtained. And the fifth and last column represents the difference between the real GDP per capita in 2018 minus the best level of real GDP per capita ever achieved. And I have highlighted in yellow some countries, for example, Cote d'Ivoire. Cote d'Ivoire is the most important economy in the franc zone. And you will see in this table that the real GDP per capita for Cote d'Ivoire in 2018 was 1/3 lower than the best level it achieved in 1978. That means currently Cote d'Ivoire has not catch up yet with its best past peak of real GDP per capita. And we also observe the same pattern for the largest 3 Central African economies. I highlighted them, Cameroon, Congo, and Gabon. they still have not returned to the highest levels of real GDP per capita, which they reached in 1987, 86 for Cameroon, 1984 for Congo, and 1976 for Gabon. That means the average Gabonese citizens is now less rich than he was, let's say, 4 decades ago. Its real GDP per capita had been divided by 2 since 1976. That is, let's say, the impact, economic impact of the Franc zone. That means long-term deflationary policies. That means long-term economic decline. When they have a crisis, the crisis will be badly managed because of the fixed peg, because there is no credit creation, and because there are huge flows, outflows of financial flows. And so we could say, we could add to that picture that there are very low levels of human development in most of the CFA zone countries. The UNDP, United Nations Development Program, created an index of development called Human Development Index. And in 2018, we see that Niger, Central African Republic, and Chad, who are all members of the Franc zone, they had the lowest score on this index out of a total of 189 countries. And overall, 10 out of the 14 CFA Franc using countries belong to the low human development group. So that means that there has been no genuine development in this group of countries using the CFA Franc. Other important statistics are also capital flight. And this capital flight is favored by the policy of free transferability. And there is a very important work done by 2 economists, Nicomena and Boyce. They did not deal with the CFA Franc, but they had some statistics which are relevant for the CFA Franc countries. For example, between 1917 and 2008, for Cote d'Ivoire, the capital flight is estimated at 66.2 billion US dollar. 66.2 billion US dollar. This is 6-fold its foreign debt stock. Same thing for Cameroon, 33.2 billion US dollar. 13-fold its foreign debt stock. That means normally Africa is a net creditor. These countries are net creditor to the rest of the world. But as they are facing this financial bleeding, they are often obliged to be under structural adjustment policies. And this is something which is facilitated by the CFA Franc. I'm not saying that all these capital flights are due to the CFA Franc, but this is facilitated by the CFA Franc and the CFA Franc countries. Some of them, like Cote d'Ivoire, Cameroon, are particularly exposed to this type of capital flight. And so the last part quickly, which alternatives to the CFA Franc? There are currently four options to go beyond the status quo. The first option is a symbolic reformism. Symbolic reformism consists of touching on altering the fundamentals of the CFA Franc system. This includes proposals such as changing the name of the CFA Franc, having banknotes and coins manufactured outside of France, and even firstly reducing the deposit rate of foreign exchange reserves at the French Treasury. And this is the option championed by the French government and especially French President Emmanuel Macron, because they see that there have been more and more demonstrations in Africa and also in France against the CFA Franc. And most of those demonstrations, they tend to point the symbolic aspects. And so President Emmanuel Macron and the French government, they want to change symbolically the CFA Franc to get rid of those aspects which are embarrassing and to maintain that what I call symbolic reformism. The second option is what I call adaptive reformism. It consists in adapting the CFA Franc zone to the current context marked by the economic and geopolitical decline of France and the euro, but with the ultimate objective of maintaining it. So this includes proposals like making the parity of the CFA Franc more flexible, because the peg to the euro is too rigid and undermines the price competitiveness of African countries. And as argument to get rid of this peg to the euro is that the African countries of the Franc zone are less and less trading with the Eurozone. They are trading with China, and they are trading with other partners in Asia and also within Africa. These proposals include also Europeanizing further the CFA Franc management. For example, instead of having a French guarantee and French representatives sitting in the organs of the Franc zone central banks, we would have a European guarantee and also European representatives sitting in the board and other organs of the central banks of the Franc zone. This is the option favored by former French Minister of Finance and former IMF Managing Director, Dominique Strauss-Kahn. So this is adaptive reformism. There is another option, neoliberal abolitionism, contrary to the two first options, because the two first options, they are based on maintaining the CFA franc, even getting rid of some symbolic aspects which are embarrassing, or some aspects like the peg. But they are premised on maintaining the CFA franc. But option 3, neoliberal abolitionism, requires the demise of the Franc zone. It promotes an exit from the CFA franc that follows the neoliberal monetary integration model, the Eurozone type. That means getting rid of the CFA franc, but having a monetary union like the Eurozone in Africa. That means tropicalizing the Eurozone in Africa. And this is the option put forward by those who promote the idea of a single currency for the 15 countries of the Economic Community of West African States, the ECOWAS. The ECOWAS includes the 8 countries in Africa using the CFA franc. The ECOWAS countries had since 1983 a regional currency project, but the launching of this currency has been postponed several times during the last 2 decades due to a lack of technical preparation and to a lack of political will. Because the CFA franc using countries, at least their leaders, prefer to remain under the monetary tutelage of France, while Anglophone countries like Nigeria and Ghana, they refuse to be part of a monetary union where France have any role whatsoever. And option 4, last option, it's what I call sovereign abolitionism. That means exiting from the CFA franc, but not through a currency union following the neoliberal model of economic integration, but create an alternative currency arrangement that strengthens the sovereignty of countries individually and collectively. And this sovereign abolitionism favors a system of what we call in our book solidary national currencies. That means each country should have its own national currency and its national central bank, and its parity should be determined according to its economic fundamentals. There should be a creation of an African monetary fund where part of the foreign exchange reserves of African countries are pooled so that they could lend themselves their own reserves and they could issue, let's say, international debt together, having lower, let's say, facing lower interest rates on the debt they issue on international markets. Having a common payment system and clearing system to facilitate trade between African countries, and having also common policies to achieve energy and food self-sufficiency, because most African countries are losing, let's say, huge amounts of foreign exchange reserves because they do not have their food self-sufficiency and their energy self-sufficiency, despite the fact that they have all those resources domestically. And this option of solidary national currencies have been championed by the 2 best African economists having worked on this subject. On the left, you have the late Franco-Egyptian economist Samir Amin, who was the first critic of the CFA franc. He was born in 1932, and he was the author of major books such as Delinking, you might see it in the image, and Eurocentrism. In the mid-70s, Samir Amin advised CFA franc countries to opt for a system of solidary national currencies, but he was not followed by African head of states because they were still influenced by France. And at that time, Amin was based in Dakar because he was a scholar there. He was a professor. and also he was running the IDEP, an Institute for Economic Development and Planning. At that time, Samir Amin was spied by the French Secret Services, and yeah, he died 2 years ago after a prolific intellectual and activist career. On the right side of the screen, you have the picture of the Cameroonian economist, Joseph Tudiang Quemi. He was born in 1937, and he was a very talented economist. He was a former IMF staff, International Monetary Fund, but he resigned from the International Monetary Fund because he was harshly critical of their policies. In 1918, he wrote this book, Monnaie, Servitude et Liberté, Money, Serfdom and Freedom, which has not been translated yet into English. In his work, he also advocated to abolish the CFA Franc, and that each CFA Franc countries issues its own currency. He died in unexplained circumstances in 1984 at the age of 47. So in conclusion, I would say that nobody knows when this harmful system of monetary colonialism will end, but one thing is sure: the monetary status quo is unsustainable, as evidenced by the fact that an Afrobarometer opinion survey released in 2019 shows that third of the Togolese people think that the CFA franc benefits France, and first of all, that it should be abolished. As you could see also in these pictures, there is a growing, let's say, growing popular protest against the CFA franc and more generally against French influence in its former African colonies. So all those signs show that the current monetary status quo is clearly not sustainable. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sylla. That was just, while you were talking, I was just like, wow, wow. And I followed the debate in Senegal, and I totally agree with your conclusion. So this thing cannot continue. So my question, okay, and I just wrote on the chat, if anybody has questions, it's the time, please write them in the Q&A, and my colleague, Dr. Isaac Kalumbu, will start reading them. So my question is, I understand like this lack of political will, but I am sure there is a fear. Like we can see that through your presentation, that if you try to do something, anything about these things happen. But what happened to Guinea, is that something that's possible? Do people talk about that? Like, let's say if Senegal decided tomorrow to leave, could France do the same thing it did? Has anything changed internationally so that that wouldn't be possible, or why? Any insight?
Yeah, the repression of Guinea has been a shock for African countries, Francophone countries. And since then, most of them think that if they have to take more independence vis-a-vis French, they will be submitted to the same repression. And I think that this fear is entertained by France. And there is also the fact that the political system we have is somehow linked to the currency issues, because the type of leaders we might have in our countries, Francophone countries, are leaders which would never challenge the CFA franc. So in some respects, if we want to change the CFA franc, we have to change leaders. But we could not change our type of leaders, because if you don't have the consent of France, you can't be elected. Because if you are against France, we will not have, let's say, financial support from France, and you will not have, let's say, mediatic support. Because if you say, I want to get rid of the French currency, you will have all the mainstream newspapers in France saying that this guy is anti-French, and he's against French interests, and you won't be elected. So we are in a very complicated situation, and I think only the people organized could change the situation. But I think that African countries could leave the CFA franc with, let's say, less damage compared to Guinea. Mauritania left the Franc zone in the 70s. Madagascar too. Cote d'Ivoire and Senegal are big countries compared to those. Cameroon also. So I think it's just a matter of organizing the people and to try to live with, let's say, good leadership.
Okay. Isaac?
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Sylla, for that very fascinating talk. A very important topic, and it's really quite bothersome that 60 years after the general period of independence in 1960, we are still talking about a currency that is dominated and controlled by a former colonial power. It begs the question of whether we should be talking of a former colonial power when we talk about that. But let me go to the questions here. I have a question from Mariana Sow, that says, hi, great introduction. A question on the French guarantee of the convertible or convertibility of the franc. Is this a truly useful guarantee? What does it look like in practice? In what situation would the franc not be converted? In addition, what is the rationale behind guaranteeing the convertibility into euro, whereas there are other currencies such as the pound and the dollar, which such guarantee does not exist and that does not seem to pose a problem?
Yeah, this is a very good question. And it's a central issue when we talk about the CFA franc, because the only argument explaining why France is involved in our monetary matters is that the French guarantees the convertibility of the CFA franc. But what does this guarantee means? It's a, let's say, budgetary pledge. It's a promise. The French Treasury. So it's not the Bank of France. It's the French Treasury says to the African central banks, the BCAO and the BEAC, if you are devoid of any foreign exchange reserves, I could lend you the desired amounts in euros. That's the meaning of the French guarantee. But at the same time, they have put rules saying that you do not have to exhaust all your foreign exchange reserves. If there's a possibility that you exhaust your foreign exchange reserves, you have to change your monetary policy so that it became more restrictive and you would reconstitute your foreign exchange reserves. So that means that there is no such thing as a French guarantee. No other country could guarantee a currency of another country. What guarantees your currency is what guarantees your economy. If you have the real resources, if you have the land, if you have the expertise, if you have labor power, etc., this is the guarantee for your economy. What guarantees your economy is what guarantees your currency. But the French government, I think they take African, let's say, citizens are, let's say, illiterate in economics or in finance. So they could tell them, yeah, I'll guarantee your currency. And if you look at their budget, because as I said, this is a budgetary pledge, you will see that in the lines, the French government need this argument to say that I have to watch your internal monetary affairs because I provide the guarantee. So African countries could say, thank you, France, we don't need your guarantee. We'll go along. But yeah, I think this is an argument we should need. But what is sad, you will find many people from, let's say, with a financial background, economist background, saying that France is guaranteeing our currency. We are living in an era of fiat currency. That means the currency is not pegged to gold or to any other commodity. It's just fiat currency. It's based on trust. So every country issues its current currency based on trust. And if you manage well your currency, that means you create your currency based on the productive resources you have. Yeah, you have a good currency, a strong currency. But if you issue your currency and it's not based on the resources you have, this won't work.
Right. Thank you for the answer. I have another question here from an anonymous attendee, and the question is, the CFA system looks like 21st century extortion. Why is the international community watching while such injustice happens?
Yeah, generally the argument is that the CFA Franc countries are sovereign countries. And so the other countries will not interfere in their, let's say, own internal affairs. So that has been, let's say, the standard discourse. Even in the European Union, they will say that, yeah, those are sovereign countries. And if they have bilateral agreement with France, yeah, that's their sovereignty. So we are not going to interfere. And you will find that African countries themselves, their leaders, they will say that this is a good currency. This provides us stability. This provides us financial attractiveness. We know that all those arguments are not well grounded, but the head of state themselves will say that because they are in power and they are backed by France. For example, in Central Africa, you will see that most of their leaders have been there for at least 3 decades. So if you were to sum up their the duration in power is more than a century, more than 100 years, you see. So those leaders, they could not descend towards France. And yeah, all the other countries, you are struggling. It's your decision. That's why escaping the CFA Franc had to be a democratic process coming.
It seems like we've lost you. We've lost the audio there. Are you hearing me, Dr. Sylla? Dr. Sylla, do you hear me? I think we've once again lost his audio.
Yeah, I think he'll come back.
Welcome back, Dr. Sylla. Do you hear me now?
Sorry, we had some slight internet issues.
Yeah, this is to be expected. You're so far away. So this kind of thing is going
normally that works, but yeah.
Yeah.
May I make a suggestion? And if you could turn your video off, that might increase the power for your voice.
Okay. Okay.
While you do that, I'm going to go to the next question.
Okay.
And the next question is from Jamil. And the question is, why is the CFA implemented in the West and Central African countries, but not in the North countries, as well as they were French colonies? In other words, why in West and Central Africa, but not in those countries in the north of Africa that were French colonies as well?
Yeah, I think this is linked to the way decolonization was implemented in the, let's say, in North Africa and in Sub-Saharan Africa. Because in North Africa, for example, Morocco and Tunisia were protectorates. So they had their independence before the other African countries. They had the independence in 1955, 1956. Whereas Algeria won its independence through a war of liberation. In Sub-Saharan Africa, France anticipated their decolonization and told them, I will concede independence, but you will not have the sovereign attributes. So you have to sign cooperation agreements. And that is the most important reason explaining why in North Africa, they are, let's say, they are not in the CFA Franc zone, while in the most former colonies, French colonies, they are still in the CFA Franc zone. Countries like Vietnam were also in the Franc zone. They did not use the CFA Franc, but they had a similar system. But they also escaped because they had a war of liberation, and they had leaders which were committed to break the colonial link with France. That has not been the case for sub-Saharan African countries, because most of their leaders also have been trained in France, and they think like, let's say, ordinary French people, and they are very loyal to French interests.
Thank you. A question from Carlotta member. Dr. Sylla, thank you very much for this insightful presentation. If possible, I would like to know your opinion on the transition of the CFA Franc to ECO or ECO in the WAMU zone.
Yeah, it's a very important question. First of all, what is the ECO? The ECO is short for ECOWAS. ECOWAS is the Economic Community of West African States. And as I said in my presentation, this regional community had a project of a single currency for its 15 members since 1983. Last year, they decided they would name that currency ECO as a short for ECOWAS. But what happened is that France and Cote d'Ivoire decided they would rename the CFA Franc ECO. So in some way, they created a confusion by trying to rename the CFA Franc ECO. And the original ECO of the ECOWAS had nothing to do with the CFA Franc. But when they say now they want to rename the CFA Franc into ECO, they want to create confusion. And the confusion has been installed in the heads of many of our compatriots. But I believe that it was a deliberate move by the French President Macron and its Ivorian counterpart, Alassane Ouattara. So I think that maybe they will try to rename the CFA Franc ECO, but the Anglophone countries, Nigeria and Ghana, might veto that for sure. At the same time, there is no prospect of seeing the 15 West African countries launch soon their single currency, because there are two sort of reasons for that. The first kind of reason is that they have put in place some criteria to belong to the future ecozone, but those criteria are not filled in by any country, because those criteria have been copied from the Eurozone. For example, they should not have a public fiscal deficit of a certain size, not a public debt of a certain size, not a certain level of inflation, etc. All those criteria came from the Eurozone, and they have copied that, and it can't work because African economies are different. They are more volatile, they are more dependent on the global economy, on the prices of commodities, etc. And the second reason is much more important, and it's political. The 8 countries using the CFA Franc, they do not want to delink with France. And Nigeria and Ghana are saying that if you do not delink, we could not have such monetary union. And Nigeria is also saying that I am the, let's say, the regional power and the continental power. My GDP is, let's say, 2/3 of the regional GDP, gross domestic product. And so Nigeria could not be in a monetary union where Nigeria is not the boss. And the project of the French government, allied with some African countries, is to try to block Nigeria, to enlarge the CFA Franc zone, and to exclude Nigeria. So we have this geopolitical struggle currently in West Africa.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Dr. Sylla. There are 2 more questions here, and I'm going to combine them because they are sort of going in the same direction. The first one asks simply what to do from this point onwards. And then the second question says, thank you for a fascinating presentation. What popular support do you see in Senegal or elsewhere in West Africa to adopt a universal West African currency? I am thinking in particular of the lack of interest in increasing a customs zone or shared currency.
Yeah, what could be done? I think that I would say that with some other African economists, we have provided all the ins and outs of the CFA franc on economic terms. Now, most of our, let's say, populations, they know that this is a currency arrangement which is harmful to our economies, to our prosperity. That means at the technical level, yeah, we won the debate, we won the argument. But politically, it's much more difficult because if you want to change this system, you need political leaders who are dedicated to delink, let's say, with friends. I would say to sever this colonial, neo-colonial link. But we don't have such kind of leaders. That means that we need, let's say, much more, let's say, people organizing to oppose the CFA franc and also to oppose the current African leaders. That's how I see things. That means the democratic, let's say, change we are aiming for in Africa, and especially in Francophone Africa, is a part also of the fight against the CFA franc. Regarding the second question, I know that many of our compatriots are Pan-Africanists, and they are vying for African unity, and I share that. But I do not think that the African continent, at a continental level or at a regional level, need a single currency, because we have to be, let's say, coherent about what we want. Because a currency is an instrument of a state. Every currency is a creature and an instrument of a state. So if you want to have a single currency in West Africa or for the whole continent, we have to be ready for a federal government, African federal government. If we are not ready for an African federal government, it's better that we do not have, let's say, a single currency. Because if you have a single currency, what will happen is what happened for Greece in the Eurozone. That means you became a colony. It is as if we were integrated African economies without Uncle Sam. That's the project of the ECOWAS, having a single currency, but no federal treasury to back that currency. So imagine you have the United States of America, but you have no federal treasury. Every state has its own loan. Every state has its own budget. If a state has financial difficulties, these states will be exposed, let's say, to international financial markets. And those international financial markets will dictate, let's say, their conditions. So it's a loss of political sovereignty. And that's what happened with many countries of the Eurozone when they surrender their own currency to be member of the Eurozone. You take the case of Italy, Spain, and Greece. They have lost all monetary sovereignty by joining the Eurozone. And they have their populations get impoverished by being a member of the Eurozone because they have no Uncle Sam in the Eurozone. And African countries want to emulate the same model. I think this would be, let's say, a mistake, a big mistake to try to have that. If we want to have a single currency, we have to be ready for a federal state. That's why the kind of interim, let's say, currency arrangement I would advocate is a system of solidarity national currencies. Because the point about having a common currency is that this will facilitate trade. But we could facilitate trade using other instruments. For example, if we have a common payment system, this will facilitate trade. If we want to be, let's say, more solidary in the management of foreign exchange reserves, we could have an African monetary fund who would, let's say, centralize part of our foreign exchange reserves. And we could, let's say, lend each other our foreign exchange reserves, part of it. And we could issue collectively, let's say, bonds, so that the interest on those bonds will be lower than if we were to issue it separately. So there are many instruments we could use to achieve what is expected of monetary unions without, let's say, the shortcomings of monetary unions, because monetary union is a very complicated matter. It's a political matter. It's not an economic or technical issue. It's a political issue. if you want currency union, you have to be ready for the federal state. And I don't think that African countries are ready for that.
Right. And the last question here is quite connected to the last few. And the questioner wants to know what are the responses of African governments to current demands for monetary sovereignty? So for instance, the African Union, its stance on this situation, and do they have any power to speak up other than default to the idea that these are issues that affect sovereign nations, and therefore sovereign nations need to deal with the problem. African unities to help other countries succeed, right? So does the African Union have any say in this situation? Does it have any sway? Have other African governments tried to intervene?
Yeah. For now, until now, the African Union had no say about the CFA Franc arrangement. And we have to say that, sadly, we no longer have committed Pan-Africanist, let's say, regional organization or continental organization in Africa, because those organizations have been, let's say, captured by the neoliberal, let's say, mindset. For example, I saw many experts working at, and many officials working at the ECOWAS, saying that the CFA Franc arrangement is a good arrangement because it provides stability. Because they are, let's say, reasoning with a dominant narrative that African government should, instead of trying to give a job to all of their, to everyone, they should just stick to have a low inflation environment, exchange rate stability, and also to attract foreign investors. That's all their economic policy. They could not conceive of seeing African governments doing what all governments had done to provide jobs, to create prosperity for their populations. So even at the level of the African Union, they are not committed to a kind of economics which would liberate the continent. They are exactly articulating the same type of economic policies which we would find, for example, in the European Union, and which would be advocated for France, for example. That's why most of the officials, when they say about the currency union, they say that, yeah, it provides stability. And this discourse about stability means that, yeah, you have stability for the rich, but for most of the people, they will have no job and their income will decline more and more. That is what is sad. So when we need a new kind of Pan-Africanism, so what we observe at the level of nation states is also relevant at the level of institutions like the African Union. They are not Pan-Africanists at all, sadly.
Well, that does it for all the questions that we have. Thank you so much, Dr. Sylla, for your wonderful presentation. I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Awasa.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Kalumbu. And thank you again, Dr. Sylla. That was fascinating. And thank you, everybody, for attending. And please join us next Thursday, same time, 12 p.m. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much.